So the first question to explore with you is, what does collective thrivability mean to you?
Yeah, this is one I was really as I read that question, I thought of two things. One was, what does it mean to me in an ideal sense, like that I would love to see happen, and the other is, which relates to a later question of um, uh, what I think is actually going to be achievable.
Yes,
And I have this realistic part of me that says we may not be able to achieve what I would hope we could achieve. And
yes,
so I'll start with the more ideal or utopian kind of idea. I think of collective thrivability immediately. My 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 reaction to the conceit of human condescension comes up.
mm,
That I think of collective thrivability as not just humans; it's the entire biosphere.
yes,
And so I have a sensibility about complex ecosystems and biodiversity, and that being essential for human thriving. But at the same time, it's not to focus on humans thriving at the neglect of that,
hmm,
which I think often happens when people talk about geoengineering or something like, we can do this thing that'll keep the population level of humans at where it is, but it is to the detriment of biodiversity.
yes,
So for me, collective thriving, my immediate place I go is planetary scale health and well-being of the biosphere,
mm,
and the kinds of measures for it are really at whatever scale you're looking at. So we could talk about the developing individual person, like the
mm,
child we were just talking about,
yes,
the entire biosphere. There are a set of metrics about nourishment for supporting the living process of whatever scale it is. So if it's a tropical rainforest or a coral reef system or a person or a community, that whatever the nourishment is, the nutrient flows that are needed to to have a healthy, vibrant existence need to be
mm,
present. And so for me, collective thrivability is about a planetary scale set of boundaries that we don't cross
mm,
that keep that dynamic process going. Um, and probably the principal measures are going to be around biodiversity. I really like the Stockholm Resilience Center's
mm,
planetary boundaries for
yeah,
this. But without going into what those are, it's like a kind of health and resilience capacities of living systems,
mm,
but at a planetary scale.
yes, wonderful. And then you worked also on what is achievable, right? That's the other one that you mentioned. So which one do you feel is achievable?
Well, one thing I've been thinking is that there's time scales. I
Yeah,
think some things are unachievable in shorter time scales, but are achievable in longer time scales. And here I think about things like the human population and a kind of Malthusian collapse that
mm,
is, as I assess the kind of the global trends, I think that we are already in a collapse dynamic,
yeah,
and that some part of it is unavoidable. So when I think of thriving, I don't think of it as a static measure, like we've achieved some level of complexity in our social
yes,
systems and it stays there. But instead, I think of it as the even in a collapse dynamic, there are some system capabilities that aren't lost,
mm,
so that there can be this resilient kind of reemergence later.
yes,
And
yes,
I say it in this way because I feel like if we think of thrivability on the timescales of the next 10 years or the next 30 years, then I don't think they're achievable. We have to transition away from fossil fuels. We are in a process of moving toward runaway global warming.
yeah,
We need to try to avoid triggering runaway of global warming, but we're already in a place that's causing an unraveling of the biosphere. Um, um, so I guess maybe I'd say it this way. I read this really good article about a
mm,
year ago by a researcher who studies mass extinction events.
yes,
And the article was like a popular kind of a high level scientific journalism article rather than
mm,
a research article, but it was still very technical.
mm,
And the point that they were making was that we are not in a mass extinction event, and that we need to be careful to clarify that we are moving toward one, but we're not in one.
okay,
And they were saying that when you study historical mass extinction events, there's this cascading systemic collapse that happens
mm,
that causes entire clades to go away. If you
mm,
know, in the taxonomy of biological systems, clades are
yeah,
classes: kingdom, phylum, order, class. And class is things like mammals.
Yeah.
You're at a level of a class is a very diverse category. It includes a very diverse set of species within it. And when you're talking about mass extinction events, clades go away, or at least a few clades go away. Yeah. Most of them don't. It's a very resilient categorical level. But when you're talking about something like mammals going away, or vertebrates going away, mollusks going away, then you're in a mass extinction event. And you might have 90% of species go extinct that are living at the time. And so it'd be catastrophic for complex organisms. Humans would be very unlikely to survive a mass extinction event because we're a subset of a much larger biological category, like mammals. And I was struck by it because it's an extreme situation that is so far beyond what we're able to normally conceptualize that most people have. I think even the experts in that area would struggle to visualize what that kind of a collapse looks like. But it comes back to this thing of what do I think is achievable? I think it's achievable to avoid that kind of mass extinction event.
Yes.
We might have 20 or 30% of the biodiversity go away, which is still several million species. But we may not have a cascade, an unraveling of the complexity of the world's biosphere, the level of mass extinction event. Which the point that the guy was making in that article was, if we had a real mass extinction event, there would be no bouncing back. It would be several million years before biodiversity and biological complexity reemerged, maybe even hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah, that's huge.
And that loss of resilience at that scale is what I think we're at risk of going into. We're not there yet, but I think that we are not able to avoid a further decline of the biosphere, at least for a few more decades. The turnaround time will require a reduction in human population, probably a period of loss of social complexity in human systems during that time. But I think we can avoid losing the ability to bounce back.
Yes, and you made a very important point earlier. That's about shifting the focus to the health of the system, so that even if there is collapse, then it can be the health of the system that helps for it to be regenerative later or regenerate itself. Yes. So would you then say that if we were to shift the focus really on what makes the system healthy, even within systems that are dying and collapsing, that could perhaps also help us avoid these mass extinction events?
Yeah, it's very much the same. The solution in avoiding the worst is the same.
Yeah.
One way of looking at it is to go to a really human scale and say, what causes a person to be thriving?
Yeah.
And the summary of lots of research would be that humans thrive in nurturing social and ecological environments. And then we ask, what does it mean to be nurturing? And to be nurturing is to be validating of basic autonomy and respect and dignity, but expressed in very specific ways. So it'd be the absence of environmental toxins, but also the absence of social toxins. And social toxins could be thought of as aggressive, coercive, harmful behaviors.
Yeah.
So extreme versions would be like abuse, where if we're in a relationship and I'm physically or sexually abusive or emotionally abusive, bullying behaviors and things like this. But also there are less extreme versions, like the lack of nurturance. So neglect, failing to pay attention when attention is needed, these moment-to-moment feedbacks that create nurturance. And so if we take that as a kind of a sketch of what the design criteria are for regeneration, there's a necessity for there to be network connectivity, for there to be layers of system feedbacks. So it's not just that there's a positive or a negative feedback, but that there's a series of self-regulating feedback systems that create the capacity for the system to respond intelligently to the changes that are happening.
So that brings me to a connected question in this, is that if you're looking at the conditions you just described for thrivability, yes? And we have other conditions, or maybe the same, this one I want to explore with you with regards to our awakening. So we want people to wake up to the severity of what's happening. Now, we often find that people start to wake up only when they're at the back against the wall, they can't move any further, there's a dramatic experience, there's often pain involved, yes? Whereas when we just talked about thriveability, it is very much in a very different direction. It's for it to be not a painful growth. How do you see that? The relationship between the conditions for awakening and the conditions for thriveability.
One thing is, I think thrivability is similar to concepts like hope. At the beginning, when someone hasn't thought much about it, they think of it as just a kind of touchy-feely positive thing. But actually, it's a paradoxical thing. To be hopeful is to confront hardship and loss and to struggle through it, even if one doesn't think they'll succeed. And so to have hope in a deep sense involves pain and struggle and loss. And I think of thrivability in a similar way, that to be thrivable means to be able to tolerate some kinds of loss, to be able to be hardened and toughened through certain kinds of struggle. And so in one sense, I think that thrivability often gets talked about only in the positive,
yes,
without recognizing the role of struggle.
Yes.
And it's easy to go too far into the struggle component of it. But one thing that I've observed from it was really a friend of mine, Clinton Callahan, who brought it to my attention. And I know from your work with Indigenous communities, you'll recognize this, that in the modern world we don't have initiation rituals.
Exactly.
That, or at least we have initiation rituals, but they don't lead to adulthood. Whereas in indigenous cultures, there have been, through cultural evolution, the emergence of rituals that have the right level of isolation and struggle and potential for real loss, but at the same time enough containment and safety and support that people can go through difficult transitions and have these transformative processes in adolescence. And I feel like in the modern world, we don't have those. And so we have a lot of people who are grown-ups, but they're not really adults in that sense. They haven't learned how to struggle and find loss and then be supported by their communities and come out as adults on the other side. And so what happens is this awakening process is painful for them because there are not initiation rituals to awaken them. And so if we take lessons from indigenous cultures that haven't lost those initiation rituals, those whether it's fire walking or it's the sweat lodge or pick which culture it's in, that there's real danger in them. It's actually essential that there's real danger in them. They have to come to know themselves in those struggles, but they come through on the other side with other people who have been through similar experiences, or at least similar rituals. Parts of the experience are unique to them. And what we have instead is things like graduating high school and going to college and things that are considered to be initiation rituals, but they're not really. And so I think we have a loss of thrivability because we have a loss of cultural traditions that prepare people for the awakening processes. And so we have an absence of ability to talk about it in contexts that don't have those rituals, which really hinders us in a serious way. So take like global warming, and I live in the U.S., which is very car-centric, and has infrastructure that requires most people to drive cars. So if I come to learn that fossil fuel consumption relates to global warming, and I care about the environment, now I'm in a position of despising myself and grieving about myself because on a daily basis I do something that hurts the planet, but I don't really see any good options. I have to drive a car, at least in the kind of forced constraints of choices that I have. So this creates a context where even if I have a sensibility of adult emotions and adult ethics, I still have a structured environment that is adolescent because I'm not able to be empowered to make difficult choices to change things. I'm in a disempowered environment. And that means that my awakening is just one of grief and despair. And then you watch things like the rise of aggressive behaviors, violent outbreaks, suicide, depression, etc., come out of that. So the awakening process is awakening into a disempowered nightmare.
Yeah, that's a very important point that you raised there, and that corresponds with what some of the elders have shared with me as well, that their concern is as well in Western societies that even if we have a rite of passage that starts as a initial initiation, we don't guide the person all the way through. And the purpose of the initiation is often to unleash and open up some new potentials, new powers, new abilities, new visions, yes? Which goes us through a process, of course, as loss and death of former identities and former selves. So it's that deconstructive process to then allow for the emergence of the new. But what's incredibly important is that the new becomes embedded then within the cultural and social and also economic context of the tribe or the community, so that the person is often given after that a new name and is given responsibilities to now apply that. What they're saying in initiation rites that don't complete well, that creative energy that is unleashed through the initiation turns destructive and it becomes like a cancer or a viral pattern. Yeah. And so what we see in our Western societies, we have a lot of triggers. People have many triggers, and as you said, that leads to a lot of frustration as well. But we don't have that healthy creative follow-up, so that people, whenever they're going through this emergence of this new or this awakening, they can then really apply that and share that, and it becomes part of their new identity or their grown, their expanded identity of self. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see that as relating to this question of the thriveability and the loss dynamic we were talking about earlier, and the awakening process that is not properly understood by Westerners because they don't have a cultural context in which to make sense of it. And the really kind of the annoying or superficial version of this is the New Age movement, where you see people who get a watered down consumer kind of a consumer market version, brand identity version of this, rather than a proper, like, deep struggle, support, reintegration process.
Exactly.
And you see, so like Joseph Campbell's work being misunderstood. Joseph Campbell's work becomes Star Wars instead of the narrative arc of Star Wars, instead of the actual transformative struggle of people in life. We externalize it into cultural icons instead of internalize it into our own lives and our own communities. Because we don't know how.
Exactly, and it becomes consumptive again rather than transformative, because we just consume then these new words and new images and new ideas, but it hasn't been developed from within. This is a very important point you're raising. Thank you. I appreciate that. And from there, I'd like to see with you for question 2. So can you briefly explain how your work supports transformational change for our collective thriveability?
Yeah, the simple way to describe what I try to do is I look at the pattern level of knowledge, mostly in the sciences, about various aspects of what's going on. So, study of human nature and what does it mean to be human? How does the mind work? What are the different tools that are used to study the mind? How do social systems work? How does complexity work? And a lot of what I do is it's kind of a catalyzing role. Is I help make that information into prompts for people to change themselves and the gestalts of insight and awareness. And then, so my role is mostly one of creating this space for shared knowledge or shared insight to arise within social systems where learning is happening, or there are attempts to make learning happen, because it may or may not be happening. And another piece of it is the network weaving piece, which is helping to connect people and ideas to each other. So one of the ways I've talked about myself is like I'm a treasure hunter where I look for shiny and beautiful ideas and people doing things, and then I help connect them with each other. And the big part of what I'm doing to make it more concrete is helping to build organizational capacities for knowledge synthesis in the social sciences, and helping encourage the translation of that into communities of practice where people are grappling with and trying to create real world change. Something that I found over and over again in my work is that the people who study social change, like the scientists, are in such a Cartesian dualism that they make it all this objective, separate, isolated kind of research in the laboratory, to use that as the metaphor. It's not the only way they do it, but it kind of comes out that way, because the incentive structures of academic work are to publish things and to get grants and to teach students, and all of the feedbacks are separate from community.
Yeah.
They actually drive people away from community. They're discouraged from doing interdisciplinary work because they don't know how to measure it. I can measure if you're the first author on a paper in an impact journal, but I can't measure your contribution if you're a collaborator with 30 other people on a project that is, like in a garden where there's soil substrates are thickening, but you're measuring the productivity of the tomatoes. Then I don't know how to account for and weight the contribution of the soil with the number of tomatoes. And there's this kind of problem in the metrics and the incentives of academia. So there's that problem in all of its different parts. But then in communities, I see people who are very knowledgeable, well-educated, well-intentioned, and doing good work, but they don't have the research supports for them to see the systems they're in.
Yes.
And so they have these cascading changes that come across their system, usually at a higher level of social organization. The example I like to give for this is someone might be working in a community, or a group of people in a community, trying to create a local food system, but they're not dealing with the global tax haven system, which is siphoning off the majority of the world's wealth and making it unavailable, which has cascading consequences across communities around the world. So no matter how good your work is in one community, the larger scale is creating these extractive dynamics in the economic system, and it overwhelms the good that is done in the small communities. And so I see versions of this where good social change work is being done at one level, but there's a higher systemic level that the people are not able to work at, or not able to see and assess properly, not able to incorporate it. They're not able to collaborate with other communities to achieve a scale of response to it.
Yes.
And it has a cascading effect. And so part of my work is showing people how to make that visible. And I was lucky that I stumbled into an atmospheric science graduate program at a stage in my life where I was exposed to how the whole systems research of climate modeling is done. I didn't do climate modeling myself, but I gained an understanding of what its capabilities are. And one of its capabilities is that it creates a technological space of computer modeling, scientific visualization, high performance computing, that together requires a synthesis of knowledge to do the work, that creates system level dynamic insight. You see how the system is working.
Yes.
You see how the ocean relates to plate tectonics, relates to factories and chemicals that are being released into the atmosphere. You can't see one part of it without seeing another, because they're all connected in the system itself. And when I see people doing social change work, I don't see them having the insight that we could do that kind of system modeling. We can actually see how the socio-political, financial, economic system is working as it's embedded in ecological systems, because you only see that by doing our system modeling. So it's this interesting thing of I don't want all social change practitioners to be rigorous scientists doing that kind of work, but I want them to appreciate that that kind of work can be done rigorously, and it can create whole system visual narrative insights. They can see how the system is changing, and that allows them to become managers of the complexity. And so that's something that so part of my work is about building the research capability to do that kind of modeling and complexity and things that the academic world actually does well, even though it often doesn't translate it into practice well, and to translate it into practice as well as possible, so that communities trying to create change become empowered to create change with all of that research support.
Very nice.
And that's like my role, is to create that capacity in the various aspects that are. I'm sure your mind is like bubbling with different pieces of what that means.
Well, and practical applications, because this is what we found. We will go in there now about systemic barriers, but it's one of the systemic barriers that this research has come about. Yes, is that the feedback in many of the systems that is generated is very distorted. because there is what people measure and what people not measure. So in the business world, they say, what you don't measure, you don't manage. Yeah. So what you can see is, because you don't work with these system dynamics methodologies, you don't work with the causal loop diagrams, you don't work with the behavior over time graphs. Yeah, they don't see patterns, and they don't see impacts across and how that comes together. That means that how they measure or perceive progress is very distorted.
My wife is trying to keep my baby away from so that I can talk to you, but the cat and the baby both wanted to come in.
Hello,
darling. And
darling.
the cat and the baby came and cried. So this is Elise.
Hey, a beautiful little girl. Hi.
I thought that rather than just leaving her cry like that, yeah, that better, sweetheart. You like to participate in these conversations, don't you? Yes, you do. Yes, you want to push the buttons on the screen. But I'll pass her back to you. But yeah, I know.
She likes to be with Daddy.
Of course you do.
That's okay. I don't mind.
We call the baby while we talk. I don't mind. Yeah, she likes to be in the conversation, so just me.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I interrupted you by getting. No, child.
Children are part of this. Yes, so I'm thinking of the practical applications of your work. If you've worked with these in business or in schools.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that there are frameworks for analysis and interpretation that are very robust, but are not widely known outside of the academic world.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, like the work that I've done in cognitive linguistics and the use of the study of conceptual metaphor, for example, is something that they've done with a great deal of rigor and clarity, but it's quite powerful.
Yeah.
And with a proper facilitator, it can be incorporated into practice fairly easily and robustly. And similarly, what are we going? Oh, you want to go? You'll go see the wax thing. Similarly, there are things like in the study of evolution, there's cultural multi-level selection, which is a framework for understanding how different levels of cooperation and integrated organization happen.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see is that these tools become really powerful heuristic tools for practitioners. Yeah. So they don't have to study it with the same rigor that an academic scientist would for it to be really useful to them, because it helps them see patterns and get clarity on things they wouldn't have otherwise seen.
Yes.
And another thing that I've seen in complex systems modeling is that there are parameters that arise, combinations of variables that you wouldn't know are the driving variables unless you did the systems modeling. Like, an example of this is that the one kind of work in the study of civilizations this guy Peter Turchin has done, he's at the University of Connecticut, is he found that if you look at historically when societies go through collapse, there's a particular threshold that's crossed in every case. Mm-hmm. And it's what he calls elite overproduction, where you have too many people vying for elite positions, and there's a hyper competition within the top echelon of power within a social system. Yeah. And that causes destabilization that cascades. So it's not simply inequality, it's when inequality becomes so extreme that a particular instability pattern emerges among the elites. That you wouldn't know to look for that threshold unless you'd done the systems modeling and identified the parameter.
Yes.
But once you've done rigorous research and know that that is the parameter, then a practitioner can use that to guide their so that you might say we want to create an intervention that releases the pressure on competition among the elites.
Yeah.
Which isn't an intuitive thing to do to deal with inequality. Yeah. But it is an intuitive thing if you have the right systems model understanding.
Yeah. Because
so this is one of the things that practitioners need to know what the best research is telling them about things like this, because they're not obvious at all. They're only obvious after the research has been done. So there's that part of it, and then there are really basic things like separating presumed knowledge from vetted knowledge.
Yeah.
So like the common sense stories about humans being selfish, rational actors is kind of a famous example now people like to beat up on because it's so incorrect and yet so entrenched that the research tells us how real human behavior and human nature works. And if we're going to act on real human systems, we have to use knowledge that is legitimate. So there's that part of it too. But then there's one other piece, which is the use of sensor networks. And I draw an analogy from environmental management. You can't manage a watershed unless you set up a monitoring system to look at all the flows through the watershed. We can't manage a social system unless we set up a monitoring system that helps us track and monitor its behavior.
Yeah.
And this is where I think we're really struggling with things like Facebook that gather a lot of the kinds of data we would need for social system monitoring, but they're set up for wrong purposes.
Yes.
So they're set up for marketing, advertising, because that's the revenue model for a for-profit company.
Yeah, there are other drivers that are more dominant. Yeah. Exactly. Yes, which brings me to the third question. So what systemic barriers did you encounter in the work that we talked about on the personal, organizational, collective levels? Yeah.
One is that most of our established organizations were built in a previous paradigm. Yeah. And so their incentive structures are misaligned. And what that means is that people doing the kind of integrative work I'm doing have no institutional homes. And so we find ourselves as kind of like intellectual Ronins, if you know what a Ronin is, like the samurai who doesn't have a master, that we don't have the institutional supports, we don't have the social supports. The funding is very scarce. The only way that we find funding is either through stumbling upon and getting lucky by finding a business model that allows us to align with purpose. Yeah. But that only works for a small percentage of us. It doesn't work for all of us. Or finding a wealthy benefactor who believes in our work and funds us. But otherwise, we're left to just struggle without any of the supports. Another kind of barrier I found is more of a narrative barrier, people not understanding it. And so really finding that the work has to happen for 10 or 15 years before it gets to a place where it's generating outcomes that people can understand. Yes. They can finally say, oh, that's what you do that's valuable. Yeah. And they kind of accusatory, like, why didn't you just say that all along? But you couldn't have told it that way. Yes. Until much later. Yes. That's a big barrier. And then a third barrier is the barrier of time, which is that we're always racing against the clock. That we, in two levels, one is we're continually putting out fires. We have little crises going on all the time that make it really difficult to hold to the long term. Yes. And another is that because we lack institutions and support, it's hard to follow through. So we try to do things that need to go through a series of steps, but instead we're just doing the first one or two steps and then reinventing because we don't have the supports to continue. And all the while, the things we're working on are made worse in the world because earlier about the initiation rituals that those of us doing this work don't get the preparation we need. Yes. And so we go through preparation in very inefficient ways. Yeah. And that includes times where we burn bridges and damage relationships and various things because we just don't know any better as practitioners. And so that's another one I think really limits us.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Because, you know, we are also very often part of the systems that we aim to transform. And then we're not receiving the support. And if we transform too much, the system says, hey, you're not like me. So out you go. You know, because then it rejects. If you too much of the system, then you don't have the capacity to transform. So that is definitely, it's a real challenge. You know,
it's a dance.
Exactly, it really is a dance. Yes. So if you look then for yourself and in your work, were you able to transform or transcend any of these four barriers that you just indicated?
Yeah, some of them. One of the things that I found is that by having a family, so now I've got the cat running out. So here's the end. I have a very social household.
Yes, I was going to say we have a wonderful social system here.
One of the things that has really been foundational for me to overcome some of these barriers is having a family system that supports it's like a little bubble of support that allows for resilience. And that is that my wife and I have built our lives together. We kind of met at a time in our lives where we wanted to both make a big change, and we were able to go on a journey to do it together. And we have created resilience in our family system by being able to live on very modest means, by having one of us being the primary earner at different times and trading off, which creates a kind of agility and adaptability. By having aligned values and life goals, that this has actually been foundational, where we don't have an institution in the world that supports us, and our own families and the places we came from aren't supportive, not in a negative sense, but they just aren't, they're not aligned with it. So we had to go out and find it or create it. And to be able to start out doing that together rather than alone was really a foundational, like when I look back in time and say, how was I able to continue this for so long? It's because we had this family system that was maintaining a resilience within itself that allowed us to pass through some very difficult periods. And so I think that's been really, really important. And another is eventually getting to the place of having the credibility that someone else who has relationships within powerful institutions begins to invite me in. So when I was invited to apply for a grant from the Templeton Foundation, I would not have been able to apply for that on my own. But working with David Sloan Wilson, a celebrated evolutionary biologist, having it funded through the Evolution Institute, like I was basically invited into a high trust community that would be easy to get that funding, but I couldn't do on my own. Even now, I wouldn't be able to do on my own. I'm not quite at that point yet. So there's this period of there being elders who come in and really play an important role to overcome the barriers. And I think that's an underappreciated thing. It's not just the successful ones. They really are playing a role of being an elder, even if they don't realize that's what they're doing. The people who have built up the trusting relationships within powerful places, like places that have money, for example, is really important to this. So that's two of the ways that...
And with regards to the preparation barrier and the initiation, were there any ways that you were able to transform or transcend?
One thing was body-based practices. So when I was young, I studied martial arts and then later dance. And my wife and I, when we go on vacations, we do bike touring, where we carry all of our gear and we go out into the landscape and get away from people. And so I found that body-based practice was really important. That when I would get to a point of being very unhealthy, I would have a lot of stress and not be exercising and whatever other things were happening, because I was in a sense obsessively focused on my work. That stage of I just have to carry this because it's my responsibility to carry it. And to not stop carrying it, to be able to continue. I had to develop body-based practices, and what they usually meant was restoring healthy behaviors that I had neglected because I'd already learned them earlier in life. And I think that's been really important, is to be able to come back and say, I know how to do stretching. I know how to exercise and train to go from poor shape to good shape. So it wasn't about always being in good health. It's about knowing how to get it back.
Which is again what you talked about earlier in terms of even in systems that are collapsing, maintain the healthy part and let the healthy part work to build the resilience up again. So the personal legacy,
really, really important. There's a sense that I could talk as if I'm very wise. I talk about these things and it seemed like I always have it together. But the reality is that there's a dynamic pattern of having it together, which is that sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, but you're able to restore it.
That's right. And when you restore it, in initiations, that's what's very interesting. You fall back on those very essential ones. And that's what pulls you through. But you learn to contextualize it and apply it in new ways. And that is the developmental factor, how you give birth to new developments is because you're using existing capabilities in new forms and in new contexts. And that's what triggers the development. Yeah, very nice. So then that brings me then to question 5. What would you say are the most important factors and conditions that need to be present for humanity to avoid irreversible collapse of our life support systems and the breakdown of social, cultural, and ecological fabrics? Yeah.
I think there are two things, or two categories of things.
Yeah.
One category is human capabilities, and the other category is what I might just call systemic contingencies. Because there are some things that are not about human systems per se, but that we have to account for. Like we have to have drinkable water and things like this. So I'll start with the human systems part because I think it's what I call the bandwidth for capacity. If we want systemic change, the bandwidth is human ability to navigate struggle. Mm-hmm. And the two measures that have come out of developmental psychology and prevention science are emotion regulation and psychological flexibility. Yeah. That anything that develops these two capacities creates the self-governing capabilities of people. That if I can have a strong emotion and then regulate my emotions, then I can moderate my behaviors. And if I can be psychologically flexible, that means I can take on different perspectives, consider scenarios, and then choose among them. But I can't choose among them if I'm merely reacting to my emotions and can't regulate them. So these two things play together. And what I see over and over again in social change contexts is the change practitioners who succeed are the ones who develop these core competencies. And they were developed early in life and throughout their lives. And that those who are less skilled at it are the ones who lack these things. So they may have really good ideas on paper, but be really good at being in groups. Yeah. Is that they don't have them. All right, sweetheart. And so one of the things that is, I think, really essential is raising children. Yes. And I don't have to say that because I just picked up my daughter. It's really essential that prenatal and postnatal care, early childhood development, up to maybe the age of, certainly up to the age of 3 or 4, but as it's critical, but all the way up to 8 or 10, when kids develop the ability to be functioning human beings. And there are some developmental windows that if they don't develop within them, either it's very difficult or impossible, depending on which part of it. We're talking about long-term social change. I think this development of children into healthy adults is the most essential place to focus. Because it's the intergenerational component. And whatever good we might do in the next 10 or 15 years will be completely wiped out by the inability of the next generation to do more when they become adults. Yes. So this human capacity, and one way I like to think of this is that, let's say a disaster strikes, like a hurricane hits a city. The city's ability to respond depends on the social and emotional capacities of the people within it at the time of the disaster, which means the preparation beforehand is what was essential. That's what determines the range of capabilities of response. And one thing we're seeing a lot of is as disasters hit, some places go back to their previous infrastructure and others invent something new. Yeah. And then you see slower versions of this, like Germany transitioning to renewable energy, where it's more of a slow motion economic collapse that they're dealing with. That they're being proactive in setting their own agenda, rather than just being reactive and falling back to what they know. That comes down to emotion regulation and psychological flexibility that becomes system capabilities. And so I think that is the most critical. Thank you very much. Ooh, some chai.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, that smells good. So I think that's the essential. If we say where's the most important work? And then the other one, what I call the system contingencies, is more about, it's almost like thermodynamics. Like there's some things we can't do because they violate the laws of physics. And so, if we've gone too far in some direction, then we have to deal with the consequences. We have to manage them because we can't avoid them. Yeah. And I think one thermodynamic observation is that whatever the carrying capacity is for humans on Earth, we've already passed it. Yeah. We have too many humans on the planet. And while people aren't comfortable, a lot of people aren't comfortable talking about this because it starts to sound like eugenics and social engineering and other very scary things, is who decides who lives.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a very difficult ethical situation, but it's one we have to deal with because we've already turned too much of the biosphere into humans.
Yeah.
And so I think dealing with this one, thank you, sweetheart, so nice. I think dealing with this one is partly about the ethics of worldviews and social and cultures rather than individuals. So it's not like I'm a white person, so I think that people who have dark skin should go away, or I'm a Catholic and I think the Jews should go away. Those tribal versions that are such horrible blemishes in human history. I think it's more about, is this a regenerative culture or not?
Yeah.
Is this an ecologically embedded culture that's responsive to its landscape or not? And that some cultural systems will go extinct. And if we have the ability to choose, we choose the ones that go away are the extractive, destructive ones.
Yeah. So would
and
you
that we
say
create the same criteria for thriveability, or the criteria for which ones die.
Yeah. So earlier you pointed out the capacity to regulate as well as the capacity to have flexibility, okay, which are also the primary indicators, in fact, when we're looking at child development and we're looking at developmental challenges or disorders. These are the two indicators that people always look at, yes? Because children who can't regulate their behavior have great difficulties, and then the same if they don't have flexibility. So would you say then, if we're looking at the cultures that may go more towards collapse, are then also those who lack the regulative capacity and the flexibility?
Yeah, I would. And I've been reading The Nordic Secret since we met Thomas and Leon. And I was really struck by how the Scandinavian country's success can be attributed to cultivating the capacity for people to become self-authoring, to achieve a level of the story given to me by my culture doesn't suit me and I have to find my own way. And that was this critical piece. And I think that the main thesis of that book will bear out. I think they're correct in it, because when you get to the cultural scale, if you have a community of people who are able to do that, then they can wield and co-create a collective narrative. And sweetie, you have to be gentle with the plant. See, she's trying to knock down she's playing with the vining plant. Be careful with it, sweetheart. So I think the capacity for people to be in a time of narrative collapse, sweetheart, you're going to hurt the plant, sweetie, where the story that they have doesn't work, is the most important time for people to find a new story rather than fall back to an old story.
Yeah.
And then we have a cliche statement in English that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a similar phrase for this. That in times of struggle, when people fall back to the stories that are familiar, then that doesn't help them to adapt to the changing environment.
Yeah.
And so they're not actually being adaptive. They're being rigid.
Yeah.
And one way of thinking this is that the inquiry has shut down. The ability to continue asking questions goes away. I know, sweetie, you want the garlic? I can't grab it for you. I only have one hand. You want the banana? Ooh, okay. It's the banana. Jessica, would you please take the baby? Thank you. Elise is like, I really want my daddy. He's having this fun conversation. I haven't got to sip my chai at all yet, but I did save the plant. But yeah, so I think this gets right back at what happens when people are under strain and how are they stress tested.
Yeah.
That you can really see the rigidity or lack of rigidity. And a really very visible example of this right now is the phenomenon of the U.S. and Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Like, what happens in a society that is so undiscerning and so incapable of collective learning that it falls back to the most interesting media spectacle, even if it's horrible.
Yes.
That this is a sign of people just grasping at anything that keeps them entertained, rather than taking power themselves in their own communities. And you can see the lack of emotion regulation and the lack of psychological flexibility, because when we have a political system that is corrupt in the way that the U.S. system is corrupt, where it basically just no longer works at all. Well, it works at extracting and hoarding wealth, but that's about all that it can do.
Yeah.
that all of the people who are impacted by it, instead of saying, well, what do we do as a community to just take care of ourselves? That political system isn't going to help us. Instead, they say, well, I just have to have my political sports team win against your political sports team. And they're very rigid in their thinking. They cling to those categories rather than think outside of them.
Yes.
They're not able to change their perspective.
Yes, yes. And this is where I was wondering, we've mentioned these two, flexibility and capacity to regulate, right? If there might be a third factor to bring it to thriveability, because you could imagine that some of the most extractive or the worst economic models, they've also been very good in regulating people's behaviors to their needs and goals. And they've been very flexible in terms of always bringing out new marketing strategies, new tools to get people really dependent. So they use both principles for their goals, and they become a barrier for this transformational change, because it seems that they become a bigger attractor sometimes for people. Because they're so dependent as well. So what could be a third factor perhaps in that, in addition to regulating capacity and flexibility?
I think I guess the philosophical word would be teleology, the purposefulness of the system. Yeah. That this is one of the interesting things about human cultures is human cultures are living systems.
Yeah.
And so there is, in an evolutionary sense, there is selection of the culture at the cultural scale. Yeah. The culture selects for what the culture needs.
Yes.
Yeah, and does things that are adaptive to the cultural system. As one of the things that makes humans different from other species is that we are so cultural. Culture is such an important part of our evolutionary dynamic that part of evolution is selecting for the culture. Basically, we have an adaptation to the environment, which includes the cultural environment, and the cultural environment is so pronounced that adaptation has to be defined to a large extent culturally.
Yes.
More so than other species. Even very social animals like ants. Yeah. Their adaptation to culture is more rigid than ours. Ours is much more dynamic. And so one of the things that means is that these capacities for humans to develop the emotion regulation and psychological flexibility for development of individual humans has to have this other component of what is the cultural system's purpose.
Yeah.
The cultural system is going to be selecting for how the humans are. It's not whether they're healthy or not, but whether they are ecologically fit or not to the cultural system.
Yes.
I'm trying to be healthy, and I'm in a pathological culture. Trying to be healthy means that I'm going to be excluded from all the economic opportunities because the cultural system is removing me like an immune response.
Yeah.
So we have to create the conditions for the cultures to focus on those purposes. So there's the teleology or the purposefulness of the system. And that's a really essential piece. Yes. This gets back at all the research on superorganisms and how they work. Their cultures are superorganisms.
Yes.
And so we have to ask, what is the teleology of the superorganism?
Yeah.
If you don't address that, then
exactly,
it's not going to work.
Yeah, that's very good. That confirms a lot. Thank you for that. And that brings me to question 6 then. What does going into the heart of systems change mean to you?
To me, going into the heart of systems change has 2 meanings. One is the idea of radical, as in radical surgery, where you try to get to the cause, the root cause.
Yeah.
So I think the heart of systems change is about dealing with root causes rather than symptoms. Mm-hmm. And so we're not doing work at the heart of systems change unless we deal with root causes. Yeah. So that's one, which is probably self-explanatory. The other one, which I think is more about what I inferred reading the chapter of your thesis about why that part of the heart of systems change is taking a fully embodied approach rather than a dualistic approach, which is that we have to think, feel, perceive, act into the systems. I'm reminded of that really awesome T-shirt that Alexandra Laszlo was wearing in Lyon about, I am the system. Yeah. That any illusion of separation of the felt experience of being alive and the felt experience of the system. Any separation between those is not at the heart of the system. That we have a recent example in the U.S. of another mass shooting at a school, and everyone's talking about regulating the AR-15, the firearm.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting question psychologically. Why do people make the conversation about the machine tool that is non-human?
Yeah.
Instead of being at the heart of what kind of human system would create young people that kill other young people indiscriminately.
Yes.
And so getting at the heart of the system is about getting into the lived experience of who are we as part of this system, and how do we feel as people who go through a process of discerning what is really happening in the system.
Yeah.
Because we have to accept our own responsibility, and we have to see our own illness, and we have to look at our own blemishes to be able to work on the system. So I think part of getting into the heart of systems change is about fully seeing ourselves as part of the system, which is really scary. At least part of it is really scary. And that there needs to be training and preparation for that.
Yes.
For the people doing the work, it needs to be normalized that it is expected if you're going to be a systems changer, you have to be going through this personal developmental journey with mentorship to be capable of seeing the system in its full ugliness, its full pain and difficulty, because we are part of it, and we have to own responsibility for it.
Yes,
Exactly.
your ball.
Very good. And the last one is a wonderful one with your daughter together. What is your key message to humanity now and the future generations?
It's actually pretty simple. That we as a species will soon decide whether we stick around. Whether we go extinct or we stay. And the most important reason we would stay is because we believe we deserve to.
Yeah.
And so my take-home message is that we will get to a thriving world through this collapse process that's happening. Yeah, I didn't manage to finish it. Baby came out. That we will only get to that place because we believed we were worthy. And so we have to find something within the human condition that is worth saving, that we feel in ourselves. Otherwise, we won't save ourselves. And so it's really like an inversion of Save the Planet. It's not just save the humans. It's, do we believe we're worthy? And what I found in my studies of the science of human nature is that we are an incredible, beautiful, inspiring, amazing creature. Unlike anything the planet has ever created, and it's arguable that it's unlike anything the planet will ever be able to create again.
Yes.
And so
Not for babies.
I think that's the core, is when we really look fully at what it means to be human. Yes, we'll see the Hitlers and the Auschwitz types of things. We'll see ecological devastation. But we'll also see something amazing and beautiful, which is that we're able to dream things into being.
Yes.
And it's this incredible, beautiful thing, because of our capacity for compassion and empathy and responsibility, the ethic or the aesthetic of being human. And so it really comes down to we will make it if we look at ourselves in full honesty as human beings, and we love what we see.
That is wonderful. Thank you. That's so valuable. Because it's, in a way, that's as a species, how you're completing this is really learning about love, because real love is that strength. You see the ugly, you see the worst, you see the darkest, and you see the beauty right there within it. Yeah? So in a way, we're teaching ourselves about love as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're at a time now where the most beautiful things we can do are going to be healing, regenerative things.
Yeah.
In the condition of the world that it's in. And so we can learn to love being human by seeing what we're able to do. And I think that's a really important lesson, that when we go into the heart of systems change, as we've been talking about it, and we discover our power to wield culture.
Yeah.
That it's not just that we are culture, we wield culture. The way that we would wield an axe or wield a sword that when we wield culture for the sake of promoting life, we find ourselves to be worthy. Yes. And all of our religious traditions have stories about this. The major world religions do. Yes. So this isn't a new idea at all, but it's a discovery or a rediscovery for most people.
Yes. Very true.
Yeah.
Yes. Very powerful. I love that. Yeah. Very nice. Before I round it off, is there anything else that's maybe even not related to the questions? Anything else that you feel inspired to share, or do you feel you've been able to share what you felt?
I guess the one other thing I would share is that, as it was, one of the soapboxes I'm on recently, is that as I've been learning about the science of cultural evolution, what I've been finding is that there are some key ideas that biologists use to understand evolution that people need to learn. And because otherwise they won't know how to navigate change. And some of them are not things that weren't necessarily obvious, like the use of population level thinking instead of individual level thinking. Yeah. Which is essential to population genetics is looking at the statistic distribution of genotype and phenotype across the population, how it's changing. You can't properly understand the theory of natural selection unless you look at the population level. Yes. Biologists know this, but if you're not trained in biology, you may not have ever been exposed to it. Yeah. There are insights like this that have proven themselves as methodologies. That methodology is the one that gradually emerged and revealed itself to be the viable methodology through a 50-year controversy within biology as it was taking form. Between about 1860 and about 1930, there's this gradual set of debates that led to population thinking. There are insights like that I think are really essential, that are, like we were saying about system dynamics, they're not obvious.
Yeah.
But I think that another message is that there are lessons we can take from every controversies.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing I'd say is that as we are going through these difficult times, we have to pull forward these diamonds in the rough that have come out.
Yes.
And really use them to the best of our ability.
Yes.
We need to be looking for them and just employing them and training people in them and spreading them as well as possible very quickly.
Yeah.